Have you ever given money to someone begging on the street, or a friend who always needs a loan that went on to use it for something amazing? They got a job, they stopped drinking, they had kids and lived happily ever after. Well, maybe. It's not impossible, but let's be honest, it's not common. If you've ever been in this situation, I bet you felt good about trying to help someone in need, at least the first few times. And that's a good thing. We should all strive to help people around us. However, good intentions have often clouded the judgment of the most gullible, affectionate, and politically motivated people in the world. And this is one of the reasons the political landscape is often so corruptible. One of the most humbling reminders about the complexity of economics and policy is how quote-unquote helping people can lead to major disasters. Helping people can mean many things. You can help somebody by teaching them a skill. You can help somebody by allowing them to learn certain things for themselves. And you can help people by simply giving them stuff, even though that won't often lead to the best outcome. And you can also help yourself by reading books from Amazon to learn anything you're interested in. Sometimes I have trouble finding books for inspiration, and that's why it's great to have a full library to choose from in Amazon. You can browse through thousands of awesome books on economic history and much more. Learn from great authors about how the world works and all those interesting topics you've been wanting to do a deep dive on. Depending on your preferences, you can pick between Kindle, paperback, hardcover, and Audible. There's a lot of great deals up right now, so scroll down, click the link below, and check out all the great options available. I know it sounds kind of crazy, but the United States has tried to help people all around the world over the last century, especially when the whole world was broken, and the U.S. was more or less unharmed. Two of the most famous cases of this were the Lend-Lease Act and the Marshall Plan, two foreign aid campaigns designed to help get Europe back on its feet during and after World War II. Billions of dollars were sent to the Allied countries in cash, food, equipment, and military vehicles to help fight the Axis powers. Much of the aid from the Lend-Lease Act even went to the Soviet Union, and the U.S. government forgave a lot of this debt after the war. Pretty crazy we did that for an authoritarian communist country, actually, and this becomes a little bit of a contradictory theme throughout history. The Marshall Plan began after the end of the war, and it continued to rebuild destroyed cities and feed starving people in the aftermath. The food that was provided to these countries receiving aid came from the American farmers' extra food. The Marshall Plan bought American farmers surplus with U.S. tax money, keeping prices nice and high for the U.S. citizens who had little problem paying for it at the time. The U.S. government would send it across the Atlantic to feed the hungry and dispossessed. But after Europe was able to feed itself, the production in America didn't stop and the surpluses skyrocketed. So in an attempt to avoid economic issues, they took action, or rather continued to take action. Instead of dealing with an inevitable agricultural slowdown, the U.S. government decided to continue sending aid, but this time to the poorest and most underdeveloped places in the world. So the U.S. government rebranded the Marshall Plan to the Food for Peace program to help developing countries raise their standard of living and continued to buy the extra American grain with U.S. tax dollars. This particular program will become a perfect example of how temporary government programs often never shut down, even after they outlive their usefulness. Feeding the poor is obviously a noble goal, and it's understandable as to why many people supported it. From the positive effect on food prices for farmers, and the feeling that your country is quote-unquote helping people, to the failed governments of developing countries looking for an easy way out of their problems. But as we know, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. Today, U.S. Aid, the U.S.'s foreign aid program, says the mission of these food programs is to reduce hunger and malnutrition for the long term and, ironically, to create stability in these countries for the purpose of U.S. national security. This is obviously not the effect that foreign aid has had, or we wouldn't be here talking about it. One of the biggest recipients of this excess American grain was India, which is unsurprisingly also one of the best examples of the failure of foreign aid. Once a nation emerging from the shadows of colonial rule, India in the mid-20th century stood at a crossroads of development and dependency. The effect of foreign aid in India, including the large amount from the United States under the Public Law 480 program, or Food for Peace, is a complex story of good intentions, unintended impacts, and unavoidable consequences. The U.S. food aid, primarily wheat, was meant to supplement India's food production and stabilize prices. Initially, this foreign aid was viewed as a beacon of hope. It promised to address immediate food shortages and support India's ambitious Soviet-like industrialization plans. Oddly, showing the willingness of the American government to ignore the, at this time, hated socialist and communist ideology spreading throughout Asia and continue to directly support a planned economy. And India ended up receiving about 40% of all the grain offered by the PL 480 program from 1955 to 1971. On paper, the American foreign aid sounded great. Everyone was getting cheap food, and America gets a big win in the press. However, beneath the surface, a different narrative unfolded. The influx of American grain in the 1950s up to the 1980s undermined India's agricultural sector. Flooding India with food aid increased the supply and lowered the price. Looking back, this is not a surprising outcome, and many people knew that this would cause issues for obvious reasons. The U.S. government wanted to keep buying grain from the American farmers partly to prevent this exact situation. Surpluses make prices go down as supply builds up and demand dwindles, making it hard for those who sell those surplus products to get a good price. A significant portion of this American aid, along with aid from the World Bank, shifted India's economic environment by channeling most of the aid into India's government. This diversion starved the private agricultural companies and farmers of much-needed business, even as India possessed vast amounts of unused farmland. Eventually, this lowered local prices and incentivized the country to ignore issues of food scarcity. And India, with some of the best land for farming at this time, became known as the country with the lowest yield per acre as industrialization and artificially reduced food prices lured labor away from the farms to the cities. Many Indian farmers faced ruin because they couldn't compete with the American imports flowing into the country, and the longer this went on, the worse it got, as resources were diverted to other things. India enacted multiple regulations to try and control the economic situation caused by foreign aid, only leading to worse outcomes. Restrictions on agricultural prices and production, coupled with badly managed public distribution networks, led to constant shortages and rationing. The Indian economy, struggling under these imbalances, witnessed large amounts of starvation, sickness, and death, and desperation within the government pushed India to continue its march towards more and more government control. The effects of PL 480 and foreign aid in general created a paradox. While the aid was meant to help the economy, it accidentally contributed to inflation in India. The Indian government, benefiting financially from aid money and selling U.S. food aid to its people, found itself entangled in a political web that focused on maximizing free handouts over domestic growth and independence. With the World Bank and the U.S. actively promoting this dysfunctional governmental structure, preferring to give aid to a planned economy. The Dean of American Foreign Aid Experts, John P. Lewis, in his 1962 book, Quiet Crisis in India, said this when talking about economic planning.
Today, planning is officially viewed as an essential concomitant of any national development that merits American assistance, and the United States government is urging such planning upon Latin American, African, and Asian governments that do not yet practice it.
With this worldwide backing, the public sector in India ballooned, with tens of millions of Indians on the government payroll accounting for around 70% of formal employment. The government growth was shadowed by a thriving underground economy caused by heavy bureaucracy and regulations that pushed legitimate businesses and regular economic activities, like owning property or building a house, underground and out of the eyes of the government to avoid permit fees, corruption, and mountains of paperwork. This planned economy approach mirrored Indian Prime Minister Nehru's belief in socialism as the answer to India's poverty and underdevelopment issues, where a strong central government would steer the nation towards rapid industrial development. So India carried on much like the Soviet Union and China, along with 5-year plans aimed at increasing industrialization and everything. In 1956, the second 5-year plan in India, spearheaded by Prime Minister Nehru and Professor P.C. Mahalanobis, prioritized public sector enterprises, absorbing almost 2/3 of the industrial sector investment into the government. India has always allowed some private enterprise, but the government often forced collaboration and reduced competition between favored companies to sustain government-sanctioned monopolies. India found itself in a straitjacket of regulations on investments in key industries, strict policies on industrial licensing, and widespread controls on prices, distribution, and labor markets, all reducing the ability to run a private business. This regulatory maze was made worse by high taxes and restrictions on foreign investments, making India one of the most controlled economies in the developing world. This kind of system turns off investors who can easily receive higher returns from more developed and trustworthy countries without worrying about legal bottlenecks the cost of corruption, or even the company's reputation if it gets caught attempting to pay a bribe to get one of the many unnecessary permits on time. Often this kind of corruption can get so bad in many countries, just like India, that the government cannot and will not attempt to keep track of it, let alone even fight it. This public sector growth didn't result in any overall growth either. Despite the extensive efforts of foreign aid, India's economic growth remained slow. From 1950 to 1985, per capita income grew at a rate of 1.5%, lagging significantly behind Asian counterparts like Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan at about 6%. This influx of aid, though well-intentioned, purposefully backed India's central planning model, distancing it from a tried-and-true Western market-driven approach and influencing much of the developing world to follow in its footsteps. As India navigated the last half of the 20th century, its comprehensive economic planning, supported and amplified by foreign aid, created a unique economic path that turned out to be somewhat of a blueprint for developing countries around the world, a mix of extensive government regulation and a parallel underground economy that the government can never control. Looking at the impact of foreign aid on India's development shows a murky picture. While conclusive evidence is hard to find, the statistics suggest that aid had little or even a negative impact on India's and many other countries' development. Multiple audits from the US government and the World Bank admitted these failures throughout the 20th century, resulting in India's experience in particular becoming a symbol of the broader failure of foreign aid when attempting to ignite sustainable development. It's true that foreign aid may have had positive effects in certain countries around the world. However, it's pretty obvious that every success story was realized after foreign aid stopped being funneled into these countries, like South Korea or Taiwan. Also, it's likely the Marshall Plan in Europe only had positive effects because the people in those countries had the knowledge to build a functioning modern society before, during, and after World War II. They didn't just forget how to build thriving cities and governments. This was not the case in India. What was needed was the knowledge and industrial skills of the West rather than rebuilding infrastructure. Confusing human capital, knowledge, and skills with physical capital, resources, and supplies was the biggest failing of these programs and still is. Handing out resources only handicapped the fledgling economy of India and promoted a dysfunctional, corrupt government. While the intention was to aid the nation in its developmental journey, the reality was a host of challenges, creating larger hurdles for the very people it aimed to help. India stands as a testament to the intricacies of global aid, the results of constant economic meddling with restrictive policies, and the unforeseen consequences that can emerge from noble intentions. With the constant failures of economic planning, unfortunately India, regardless of the world's continuous aid and the government's turn to socialism, is still struggling. Over 200 million, or about 16% of the people in India, are still food insecure, causing health problems and starvation to this day. And it's affecting children more than any other demographic in India. However, there may be a light in the darkness. With increasing economic freedom in India throughout the past decades, Indians are now suffering more from being overweight than underweight. It seems like the leaders in India may be slightly waking up to the issues of foreign aid as well, as their government takes much less of it than they did before. However, India is still taking more foreign aid today than anyone in the world, and their moves to deregulate and privatize the economy have been slow and half-hearted. It seems the allure of complete control and government aid is still much too strong for policies to change much. Foreign aid is still a problem outside of India as well, with multiple countries throughout Africa and Asia receiving foreign aid money and supplies with little or no improvement to the people's way of life. The simple reason seems to be similar to India and echoed by Ron Paul. Foreign aid is taking money from poor people in rich countries and giving it to rich people in poor countries. In war-torn countries with an otherwise very trustworthy economic system and knowledgeable populace, foreign aid might have positive effects, like in Europe and South Korea. The question is not whether foreign aid is good or bad, but why are we providing it and who will ultimately benefit from it? Are we giving it to a corrupt government with plans to steal most of the foreign aid for themselves? Or are we giving it to knowledgeable and trustworthy people of a country ravaged by war, or even a natural disaster? Also, the question of whether government foreign aid to the developing world is necessary in the first place is still open, considering the absolute disasters that foreign aid has caused, of course, as we've already seen, and that private citizens give nearly as much or more through charity by themselves. If the informed citizen picks where they put their money, is that not more ethical than taking their money through a mandatory and coercive tax, especially when their country didn't cause the issues in the first place. If we want to increase prosperity around the world, we need to lead by example. And increasing the tax burden on the people of any country by any amount for unnecessary purposes is an increase in coercion, not freedom and prosperity. Who's to say what is the right cause to spend other people's money on anyway? The careless way in which governments take people's money is in clear disregard of people's personal choice and freedom. We can only hope that more people will realize the problems these kinds of interventions cause, and refuse to use more tax money to destabilize another developing country. Anyways, that's everything. Feel free to help us out with a tip to our Ko-Fi, and if you're a creator struggling to make content, check out Danksphere in the link in the description. A production meets marketing company that helps creators turn their stories into content that grows their audience and business. Thanks for watching, and stay free.